Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Legend of Sean. Today I'm going to be reviewing and sharing my thoughts on The Last of Us after my first frightfully and coincidentally unfortunate playthrough during the current coronavirus pandemic. Now, little did I know that when I started playing this game at 2 a.m. in the morning, in the middle of self-isolation, within a worldwide quarantine, that The Last of Us is about a post-pandemic dystopian world after the spread of a fungal infection called cordyceps. The scariest nature of this game is its scientific, political, ethical, and social intelligence. Released 7 years ago, its commentary still holds true, especially today.
Los Angeles is now the latest city to be placed under martial law. All residents are required to report to their designated quarantine. Riots have continued for a third consecutive day, and winter rations are at an all-time low.
The coronavirus and cordyceps share very similar behavioral patterns. The government measures taken in-game don't veer very far off from our current state and plausible future, and The Last of Us shines a light on human truths that we are facing in quarantine today. Like cordyceps, coronavirus has made a very similar jump from animals to humans. And the scary bit is, cordyceps isn't even fiction. It's a very real fungus that invades ant colonies, literally controls the minds and bodies of its hosts before sprouting a fungus directly through the skull of its victim's head to release more spores and continue the vicious cycle. In-game, cordyceps, whether spread by a bite or airborne through spores, not unlike the cough today, first causing aggressive behavior in its victim, and then sprouts fungus from the host's head. Blinded, these clickers discover their victims by using echolocation.
Like bats. If you hear one clicking,
Did she just say bats?
That's how they spot you.
The prime suspect carriers of coronavirus? This game is really triggering. The Last of Us thrusts together two unassuming characters on a trek across the post-pandemic United States. Joel, the grizzled shell of a man who survived 20 years in quarantine since the pandemic first hit, and Ellie, a gutsy, sharp-tongued, albeit starry-eyed girl who was born into this world. The relationship that develops between the two is the heart and driving force of this game. The way you interact with enemies is mostly up to your personal playstyle, fight or flight. You can evade engaging at enemies entirely, you can stealthily pick them off one at a time, or you can wage full-out war. Depending on the type and number of enemies though, your hand may be forced on how to fight. One of the more challenging and brilliant aspects of battle in this game is that your enemies, whether soldiers, hunters, or infected, exhibit what really feels like artificial intelligence. They communicate and work together. For instance, you may assume that you've surreptitiously taken out an unsuspecting soldier by stabbing them in the throat, but the second that another enemy lays eyes on a pool of blood or a limp body, the entire pack is on red alert and on the hunt for you. Your bank of weapons, ammo, and supplies to create medical kits are incredibly scarce and only collected live as you progress throughout the game, scouring in drawers or picking them up off of limp, dead bodies, all the more increasing the sense of urgency to salvage where you can. Making it out alive from a pack of enemies without any ammo to defend yourself or any supplies to create a medical kit often still leaves you with the feeling of a sense of direness despite your win. It's just that game where your adrenaline never stops running.
Run! Run!
Go! Go! Move!
The Last of Us really would be a perfect case study for an Ethics 101 class. At the core, often asking the player the thematic question of whether to sacrifice the few for the greater good of the many. And that's a question that we often theoretically throw around, but while playing, I couldn't help but think of the very real, severe drought of resources in Italy. With hospitals overrun and a lack of respirators, doctors were literally choosing who was going to live and who was going to die based on the greatest chances of survival. Or of the essential workers who are out there continuing to risk their lives on the front line to provide food and medicine for the community. The game really forces the player to tackle the ugly truths of survival, of our most base instincts, of survivor's guilt, and of the catch-22 very human need for other humans. In the game's case, where having someone to care for can be the fire that keeps you going, or a very real vulnerability and liability. With masterful genius, The Last of Us drops any traditional sense of a boss, and instead you'll very often find that the humans of The Last of Us are much more frightening than the infected themselves. And doesn't that sound familiar? In mass hysteria, we see people panic buying out supplies out of fear, panic, and a selfish survival instinct. We see people not following social distancing orders, taking the pandemic lightly, and driving the curve upward. There is a very real fear of people who are asymptomatically carrying and spreading the coronavirus, and there's just a very real fear of people in general, even 6 feet away. While the game is often unforgiving, cruel, and gorish, it is also masterfully juxtaposed with brushstrokes of beauty. Watching Ellie discover things for the first time, or incredulously remark on the world that we live in today.
Is this really all they had to worry about? Boys? Movies?
Materialistic and superficial, is humbling in its nature, and questions the player's definition of what's important. And being in quarantine and self-isolation certainly poses the same ask, doesn't it? Revealing how important loved ones become, how important people become, and how easily we can take for granted a walk in the park. The Last of Us absolutely lived up to the legacy that it left behind and ranks a 10 out of 10 in my book. Although quite scary to play during a pandemic, and for this reason probably why The Last of Us Part 2 for a time was indefinitely postponed, its commentary held even more value to me while playing through the lens of a pandemic. When we overcome this pandemic, I'm curious to see if a worldwide cultural shift will take place. My hope is that we all put our focus on what really matters. Thanks so much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. It's just one of those games that begs discussion. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for all things gay, gaming, and Brazilian. Stay tuned.